The air was thick with an eerie silence as the clock struck 3 a.m. I stood alone in the dimly lit room, surrounded by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, and a bead of sweat formed on my forehead. I couldn't believe I was actually attempting the Midnight Man ritual. A game whispered about in hushed tones among those who sought the thrill of the supernatural. I carefully followed the instructions I had found online, drawing the arcane symbols on the floor with trembling hands. The ritual required me to invite the Midnight Man into my home, and the rules were clear. I must avoid him at all costs until 3:33 a.m. If I failed, the consequences would be dire. Despite the warnings, the allure of the forbidden drew me in like a moth to a flame. As the clock continued its relentless march towards the appointed time, I felt a chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. The room took on a malevolent energy, and the shadows seemed to writhe with unseen entities. I lit the final candle, the room now bathed in an otherworldly glow. I whispered the incantation, my voice barely audible over the creaking of the old house. The air seemed to shimmer, and a cold wind swept through the room. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but it was too late to turn back. The Midnight Man had arrived. A heavy darkness settled over the room, and I could sense his presence lurking in the shadows. I clutched the small vial of salt in my hand, my only defense against the malevolent entity. The flickering candles cast grotesque shadows on the walls, distorting the very fabric of reality. I moved cautiously through the darkened halls, the silence broken only by the distant ticking of the clock. The air felt charged with an otherworldly electricity, and every nerve in my body screamed in protest. I could hear whispers, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I turned a corner and froze. There, in the darkness, stood a tall, shadowy figure, the Midnight Man. His form seemed to shift and contort, an ever-changing silhouette that defied the laws of physics. My breath caught in my throat, I stumbled backward. The game had taken a sinister turn. The rules, once clear, now seemed like a cruel joke. The Midnight Man was no longer a distant specter. He was a malevolent force, a nightmare made flesh. I felt his gaze upon me, a gaze that pierced through the very fabric of my being. Desperation fueled my movements as I fled through the labyrinthine corridors of my own home. The shadows seemed to reach out for me, clawing at my sanity. I glanced at the clock, 3:30 a.m. The minutes felt like an eternity as I raced against time, the walls closing in around me. With seconds to spare, I stumbled back into the ritual room. Candles flickered wildly as a bone-chilling wind swept through the space. I hastily scattered the salt, forming a protective barrier. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, but the Midnight Man was held at bay. As the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the oppressive darkness lifted. The room returned to an unnatural stillness, and the whispers faded away. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. The Midnight Man ritual had gone horribly wrong, and the boundary between the supernatural and the mundane had been breached. I had glimpsed a realm beyond our own, a realm where nightmares took form. As I sat in the silence that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had lingered, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next moment to cross over into our world.